All right. So, like I said, I just wanted to say thank you because for the last 5 years I've been working on this. I never felt like I was alone because there was always another old issue of WPO I could read and learn something from, and there was just the enthusiasm and expertise of this community. So, you guys are wonderful, and it's meant a lot to me to sort of read and learn from you all. And so I'm really excited to share some of this. This is the first time I've talked about this book because it doesn't even come out for 6 months. But there is no audience in the world I would rather share it with than this one. So I'm really delighted to do that. Like I said, we're early in the design phases. We're about to get like the copies that go out to journalists and reviewers, including, I hope, a reviewer at WPO and everything like that. But we sort of have these bound copies too. So it's a beautiful cover, I think. I really think the designer did a wonderful job with that. And it's exciting just to see the book as this. But I wanted to show you one other thing from inside this because, yeah, the Kirkus review in the Star, that's really exciting. That means a lot. But this is the copy I sent to Jay Buckley, who obviously you all know very well. And he wrote me a little note inside it. He kind of helped me, make sure my facts were in order and sort of check different things. But he wrote me a nice note where he called it a masterful effort. So to have somebody who knows the expedition as well as Jay does, enjoy it, learn from it, and engage with it meant a lot to me as well. So there's one other thing I want to say if anybody is interested in pre-ordering the book. Pre-orders, and this isn't just my book, this is any book. Pre-orders are the single best thing you can do to help a book succeed because the publishing industry tracks pre-orders. So the more pre-orders that are happening, the more attention a book gets, the more momentum a book gets, the more people will see it. So if you're interested in this book, I worked with my publisher. I told them, hey, we're going to have this big meeting. There's going to be a lot of people who really love Lewis and Clark. So we've set up a discount code. You can obviously pre-order a book anywhere you want. And, local bookstores are wonderful. There's also this website called bookshop.org. And if you pre-order it there, the profits go to local bookstores. So even if you don't have a local bookstore in your community, you can do it there. If you use that code, and I've put the link for all this and the link and my email if anybody has any problems with this, I put it in the chat of our conversation. But if you go to bookshop.org and put in that code Craig15, you get 15% off the book for pre-ordering, which is a nice discount. But also there's a couple bonuses. We're putting together signed book plates. I'm going to do a book tour for this. And so it'd be lovely to meet some of you in person if that can happen. But if not, if you pre-order through that bookshop.org website, I'll go back to it so you can see it again, and put in that code when you pre-order, you get 15% off, then you get a signed book plate. And I also made some postcards with this George Catlin painting. I think it's a beautiful painting on its own, but when I was looking at Gary Moulton's atlas and sort of looking at where Fort Pierre is and where the camps were, obviously this is a copy. We don't have Clark's specific route map from this spot, but we have the copy that was made later. This is pretty close to where the most important encounters with the Lakota happened. And so this is not just a beautiful landscape. This is as close as we can get, for an age that was before photography and everything else, to seeing the world the way that the Corps saw it, but also the way that Black Buffalo saw it and his Lakota people. So I made some postcards of this just because I like the image, and it's a meaningful image to me as well. So if you pre-order it, you get a signed book plate, the book, and the postcard as kind of like a thank you to people who are supporting the book. Okay, enough of the sales stuff. I don't like doing that kind of thing. So let's just talk about John Ordway, who I very much do like talking about. This is called A New History of Lewis and Clark. And I think the simplest way to show what makes it new is to just share the table of contents with you. So like I said, it's about 500 pages long, but there's 17 chapters. And if you'll notice, the chapters don't have titles, they just have people. Because the way I decided to write this story is with rotating point of view chapters. So chapter 1 is Lewis, working with Jefferson, preparing for the expedition, all that stuff. Chapter 2, though, switches to York's point of view. And so York is in Louisville or near Louisville, waiting for Lewis to come, thinking about his life, thinking about the choices he has or doesn't have. Chapter 3 is Jefferson, and believe it or not, I found a lot of new stuff about Jefferson and sort of the political battle to get the expedition funded. Chapter 4 is Ordway, and so it goes on from there. But I think this is a pretty unique way to approach the story. It's not about minimizing the captain's contributions. They have the most chapters of anyone. I love the captains. I found a lot of new stuff about the captains, including that John Quincy Adams letter that Philippa mentioned. But it is about bringing in other perspectives. And I think it's important to do this because it's better history, but it's also a better story. If we can make somebody like Black Buffalo seem as complicated and as rational and as interesting as Lewis, which of course Black Buffalo was as a human being, then that's a better story. Because a story that's just sort of Lewis and the mountains are the only thing standing in his way, that's not as interesting as Lewis dealing with a lot of other human beings who have their own agendas and their own desires. So that's the way I tried to write the book. And instead of just sort of talking in big picture terms about it, I want to show you what writing the book in that way helped me learn about John Ordway. So the chapter is going to rotate. I mentioned maps. We got the guy who made the maps for Game of Thrones to make the map for this book, which is really exciting to me. The publisher is sparing no expense on this book. It's really going to just be a beautiful object, which I'm, as a book lover, I'm really excited about. But, there's going to be maps for each chapter, which sort of capture, what happens in that chapter and everything like that. So I want to quickly just run through why using these rotating points of view, why thinking about the expedition from different perspectives helped me. The first thing is that it's just the accurate way to do it. I mean, this vast enterprise, that's Clark's line, and he actually used that line at least 3 times that I found in different writings. The captains knew that their expedition involved lots of people. They knew that it wasn't just them who were supporting it or opposing it or making it happen. So if we tell the expedition as the story of a lot of people, we're just going to tell a more honest version of the story. The second reason is that when you pick different perspectives, you start to notice new contexts. It was really interesting to think about each famous moment in the expedition from different points of view. A quick example that I think you all will appreciate is the portable soup. Obviously, that's a beloved anecdote and a beloved piece of the material culture of the expedition. But as I was working on the Rockies, that chapter happened to be from Sacagawea's point of view. And so I was thinking, and by the way, I use the J and the Shoshone pronunciation because the Shoshone people that I worked with, that was their request. If people have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that later on in the presentation. But anyway, I was writing about the Rockies from Sacagawea's perspective. And I started thinking, from talking to the Shoshone people, I know that the taboos they have against eating dog flesh or horse flesh. We also know that Sacagawea was still breastfeeding at this point. So everybody's burning a lot of calories in the Rockies. I know that we just had a presentation about the caloric expenditures from the Corps. Well, Sacagawea was burning as much as anyone else, but another 500 more because she's still breastfeeding. So there was nobody in the Rockies who was hungrier than Sacagawea, except she almost certainly couldn't eat horse meat because that was taboo to her culture. So what that made me realize is that the portable soup, nobody needed that more than Sacagawea. We think of the portable soup and Lewis, we think of the soldiers, but maybe in the end, it seems pretty compelling to me that the person who needed it the most was Sacagawea herself. So again, that wasn't a brilliant insight by me. That was just that came out of using those rotating points of view. And when you think about these moments like the Rockies, but you try to think about what was it like for her, you can notice new things. The different perspectives also helped me dig up a lot of new documents, and I'm going to talk about the ones I found for Ordway today. I'm pretty sure I found new stuff for everybody in the book, and really happy to share that. And then finally, it pushed me to read the journals differently. Obviously, Gary, and I see his name here today, which it's an incredible honor to have him join with us. But his work was the most important thing for me. And then the beautiful digital edition that the people at the University of Nebraska and other organizations put together. I'm sure you all have spent a lot of time on it, but I really think that the thing that helped the most is not only having a authoritative version of the text, but a version of the text where it's easy to jump around, to compare, to contrast. I was able to read them differently by using this sort of point of view approach and really trying to get in. So enough big picture stuff. Let's talk about everybody's favorite sergeant. I don't like book events where an author just reads it, everybody. I think it's kind of boring, and hopefully people will read the book afterwards themselves. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the John Ordway chapters and read you some short snippets, but what I'm going to do is kind of share the research behind it. So my John Ordway chapter 4, starts out with his famous letter back home to his brother, where he really captures how frustrated he is, how bored he is, how ready he is for his time in the Army to be over so he can get back to New Hampshire and find out a way to get a farm if that's even an option for him. So we sort of start with that, a pretty classic place to start. I do want to flag one thing, though, which is this quote, "Are you among the living, or have you taken your departure for that bourne from whence no traveler returns?" Many of you probably have noticed this already, but that's a Shakespeare allusion, right? And so that's one of the things where it's worth start paying attention to. What does it mean that John Ordway, a working class guy from New Hampshire, casually alludes to Shakespeare in his letters? That's unusual at this time. So the chapter starts with Ordway sort of bored on the river, waiting to get out of the army, and then the captains show up and he joins. And then in this first section of the chapter, I kind of trace Ordway's biography. What was his life like before? I think biography is such a wonderful tool. And obviously, Lewis and Clark have both received many wonderful biographies, some of them written by people who are here with us today. But John Ordway deserves biography too. Black Buffalo deserves biography too. And so using that approach to really try to understand one person's life and experiences, I think can be very revealing. So this first section, I'm going to read you a little bit and then talk about the research behind it so you can kind of see how I was able to piece together John Ordway's backstory. John Ordway was born in New Hampshire in 1775, the youngest son in a farming family of 12. The Ordways lived in Bow, the sort of New England settlement that a British traveler called nothing better than scattering villages. Bow had a tavern and a blacksmith, a wheelwright, and a woman who specialized in spinning yarn. Most of what was scattered, though, were farms. The Ordways' farm probably included 60 or 80 acres, with pastures for livestock, fields of wheat and rye, and a family vegetable garden, along with maple trees for sugar and an orchard for cider. The family ate most of what they grew, taking small surpluses to local markets. This was easiest during the region's long winters, when a sled moved faster on snow than a wagon ever could on the erratic New Hampshire roads. Their home was one story and built of lumber, thanks to Bow's sawmill, though the unpainted boards had quickly faded to gray. So hopefully we're already starting to see the benefit of biography, to understand where John Ordway came from, what he cared about, what a good life looked like to him. But I also want to, like I said, talk a little bit about the sourcing behind it. How am I able to know these things about it? So in this case, it actually started with a book written by some local historians in Bow, New Hampshire. And so they wrote, this book's 50 years old at this point, but they wrote this book called 100 Acres, More or Less, which is a very detailed history of the town. And in it, there was actually some pretty interesting details about Ordway as well, because he's one of the more famous people to ever come out of this town. But there was also a lot of history about it. There's an ad for a farm from 1795 that was on the same road as the Ordway's farm. So when I say their farm probably looked like this, I'm basing it off that description, which describes what a typical farm was like in this neighborhood, and trying to use that to sort of capture what Ordway's life was like. All right, going to read a little bit more and then talk a little bit more about the sourcing. We'll do this a couple more times to hopefully give you a taste of the book, but also a taste of how I made the book. John pitched in from a young age, working alongside his father, mother, brother, and sisters. He loved farming, loved how it required the management of many details, and how it kept the family at the center of daily life. Even as an adult, he called his mother and father honored parents. When the Revolutionary War disrupted local schools, as it disrupted everything else, the family taught John at home. There is scarcely an adult individual in all New England, noted an essayist, who cannot read and write and keep accounts. The Ordways believed in the values of industry, self-improvement, and self-control, gathering around the fireplace so John and the other little ones could listen as an older family member read from the Bible or the Almanac or a local newspaper like the New Hampshire Gazette. All right, so how do I know that this is what John Ordway's life looked like? Sometimes when you're a historian, maybe a lot of times when you're a historian, you just get fantastically lucky. And for me, what happened is that one of the great history books of the last 40 or 50 years was written about the exact area where John Ordway lived. And so this book, if you like book culture, if you like reading, I highly recommend tracking this book down. It's a little eccentric, but it's deeply researched. It's like 600 pages long, and it has so many details about what life was like in rural New England, especially if you cared about books. So I read this book, and from this book I could understand, how literary John Ordway was. It also helps that we know he could allude to Shakespeare and Greek mythology in his letters as well. But we understood how his family worked, what their values were, what their culture was like. And again, that really matters, because one thing we'll talk about in a second is how the culture clash that happened when Ordway, as a professional soldier and a son of New England, ended up rubbing shoulders with a bunch of guys from Kentucky. All right, on to another little snippet about John Ordway's life. Despite their labor and despite their love, the Ordways struggled. Their family was large, even by New England standards, and their land was rocky and stubborn. For a white man like John or like his father, land determined both present and future. It gave you your income and identity as a farmer. It gave you your vote as an American. And it gave you your legacy as a parent, something to pass to your children so they could start families of their own. But that was only if you had enough of it, and the Ordways did not. They scrambled to feed and clothe their children, with the pressure only increasing as those children, and remember, there's 10 of them, as those children approached adulthood. Plenty of families in this position turned on one another. John and his siblings chose to stay close, even if it forced them to say goodbye. In 1790, the year he turned 15, John watched as two of his older brothers, including Stephen, moved 40 miles north in search of affordable land and the independence it promised. At some point, John was forced to leave home too, as his parents placed him with one of Bow's wealthiest families, the Bryants, who agreed to take care of him in exchange for his labor. So, where does that information come from? Well, the key part of the information is that John was placed somewhere. Now, this was actually in that book I showed you early on. That was one of the details, about the Ordway's land not being very great land, but also Ordway being placed as a young man. This is not quite the same as Ben Franklin being an indentured servant, but it's very similar to that. And so it's a really important detail, I think, because it just captures how poor the Ordways were. That even though family mattered so much to them, and if you read John's letters or the last line in the journal where he talks about going back to see his parents, you know that family was everything to him. But his parents still had to have him live with someone else because they could not afford to take care of him. This was a pretty unusual arrangement at this time for a white farming family like this. And I know this because of the person you're seeing on the screen, which is a professor named Ruth Wallace Herndon. She's writing a book about this idea of placing people in New England. The book's not done yet, but one thing I did a lot was interview people. I interviewed a lot of Native people. I interviewed a lot of academics. So I talked to Ruth and I said, here's the facts I found about Ordway. Is this normal? What does this mean? What can we, with reason, speculate about his life? And she helped me out a lot. So again, that kind of expertise in connecting a new detail here. John Ordway was placed with another family because he came from such poverty. Connecting that to the research of an academic who spent more than a decade studying this in New England, that's another essential step of how I figured things out. All right, read you another snippet from the book. We've got 2 more to go. The Bryants, remember, this is the family that John is placed with. The Bryants owned more than 1,000 acres. They owned Bow's sawmill, and they lived in Bow's first 2-story home. Most important, from John's perspective, they surely owned a lot of books. A working-class farmer like his father owned, on average, 2 or 3 volumes. A family like the Bryants owned 100 or more, including Shakespeare and Greek mythology, and treatises on husbandry, which John could study once he finished his chores, reading and dreaming of someday buying land of his own. Where did this information came from? Well, this comes from a kind of a hodgepodge. That 100 Acres book has details about John. The reading becomes a necessity of life. That academic went back and read hundreds of wills from this time period. That's how we know that somebody who has as much money as the Ordways owned on average maybe 2 or 3 books, whereas somebody like the Bryants would own 100 books or more. And if you read John's letters and journal carefully, you can see that he was extremely well read, that he was often alluding to Shakespeare, to Greek mythology. Where could he have gotten those books? His family did not have enough money for those books. Books in this time period were an extreme luxury good. He probably got it through the Bryants. And so that's one of the things I think that's so interesting about his story, is that he loved his family. As a young man, maybe even as somebody who's 13 or 14, he had to move away from his family. But by doing that, he ended up at a household that had more books. And from that, he was able to become the person that he became. So the kind of information in that paragraph, that comes from reading Jackson's letters, edition of the letters, that comes from reading Moulton's edition of the journals, and then synthesizing it with a bunch of different academic books, and really using Ordway's point of view to think through this stuff. All right, last snippet from the sort of Ordway section of the chapter, and then I'll stop reading at you, I promise. John's parents continued to struggle, and in 1792 they gave up their farm and headed north, eventually moving in with Stephen. John stayed behind for 3 lonely years, working for the Bryants until he turned 21. Then he headed north himself, reuniting with his family near a village that would eventually be known as Hebron. It was a step back from Bow with log cabins, fewer neighbors, and roads you had to cut yourself. But it was also a place where Stephen could start a family and a farm. One of those neighbors was Betsy Crosby. She was smart and honest, and in John's eyes, very appealing. He began spending time with her and her family. The Crosbys had even less than the Ordways, in part because Betsy's father had fought in the Revolutionary War, only to see his wages in continental currency become worthless. Their family of 9 now lived in a one-room cabin that measured 12 by 16 feet. So this is Betsy Crosby's family, all 9 of them squeezing into a cabin of that size, a cabin roughly the size of some of the huts that the Corps would build on the expedition. So this made it hard for Betsy and John to imagine a future together, though they still did. They talked about it honestly and at length, surely after first excusing themselves from that crowded cabin. John had nothing to offer her financially, and neither family could help. What would a future together even look like? Would they marry and move again, deeper into the New Hampshire interior? So, details from that come from a book by another local historian. That first book was from a local historian in Bow. This is from one in Hebron, a guy named Ron Collins. And he wrote a really wonderful book. You can find this on Amazon for a couple bucks. Read a digital copy. Highly recommend it. It's very genealogical, and that's kind of Ron's passion, but there are still new details he drug up, including the fact that John Ordway served in the New Hampshire militia, actually under Betsy Crosby's father, which is another way to see how close those families were. A lot of those details, of course, about what John liked about her and how they discussed a life together, that's just an inference from reading the letters in the Jackson volume, where we can see, if John is talking about Betsy in these terms, it's really easy to understand what preceded that, the conversations, the relationship, the dreaming, and everything else. So that's just a little taste. I'm not going to read much more from the book now, but this shows you sort of the kind of detail we can get if we try to use that biographical perspective. And for me, this changes everything that I think about Ordway. Because when you see how much land mattered to him, when you see the farm he grew up on, when you see that farm essentially failed and how much his family had to sacrifice to try to find new land, that makes his line in his letter to his parents saying, if we pull this expedition off, we're going to be promised first-rate land. That line reads differently now, because you can understand what John Ordway wanted, what John Ordway was thinking and feeling on the Missouri. He was tired. He didn't want to see another mosquito, but he was also seeing this land, and land meant something to him in a way that I think it's hard for us to understand today unless we use those tools of perspective and biography. So, new context. Those are all some new context that I found by using this. Another thing is new documents. And I've got to give some credit to Ron here, because he was the first one who went through some of the papers at the office of the Secretary of War and found that Ordway actually enlisted not under Russell Bissell, but under a different captain named Captain Lyman. So I talked to Ron, looked at some of those same documents, and once I had that, I used electronic databases where you can search by keyword lots of old newspapers. And they don't always work, but they can sometimes work well, especially if you have something specific like a name. So I did that, and I found the recruitment ads that Captain Lyman, the guy that Ordway signed up under in New England, I found the recruitment ads that he ran in newspapers. And I think that's just an amazing document, because we can't know for sure, but it's very likely that Ordway saw this document. Maybe a friend knew he was thinking about joining the Army and shared it with him, and maybe he just saw it in a newspaper himself. And this was the sort of thing that got Ordway to join the Army, which of course was a step to joining Lewis and Clark. So let me zoom in here so you can see this. I'll read this for you. Captain Lyman of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the United States Army has established a rendezvous in Northampton and Springfield, these are both Massachusetts, so just a little trip down the Connecticut River, where he will cheerfully receive all honest, hearty young men that may wish to serve their country in the honorable profession of soldiers. They will be recruited for this regiment, but may serve in their own company if most desirable, as they will be stationed in the Garden of America, the Western country. They will have an opportunity after their term of enlistment expires of procuring the best farms in the world. You can see why that would be appealing to somebody like John Ordway. So then the ad goes on a little bit more and offers a generous bounty, good and handsome clothing, put under immediate pay, and receive kind treatment. So this is the sales pitch, right? John Ordway is in New Hampshire. He doesn't know how he and Betsy can have a life together because they don't have land. The Army is another option, especially for somebody who's coming from the kind of background that John Ordway does, and this is the pitch. I won't spend too much time on this because we got a lot to get to, but if you've read anything about the scholarship of the military in this time period, and I've read a lot, every word in this ad is a lie. They were not respected, they did not get good clothes, they were not paid in a timely manner, and they definitely didn't receive kind treatment. I zoom in my book and talk just about how Cornelius Lyman would beat his soldiers. And most officers in this time period, there's the Articles of War, and it's very tempting to be like, well, if it's in the Articles of War, this is how it happened. If we understand the Articles of War, we understand Lewis and Clark. That's not really true, though, because most people deviated from the Articles of War. The further you got from Washington, the more flexibility officers had. What's key, though, is that officers almost always use this flexibility to move towards violence. So Lyman had a unit where something went missing in town. Lyman just grabbed a cat of nine tails and started beating one of his soldiers until the soldier confessed. There wasn't a court-martial. There wasn't a paper trail. It was just violence and aggression. Officers did this kind of stuff all the time. The Articles of War wouldn't allow it, but the Articles of War didn't really matter because flexibility is what mattered, and most officers chose to draw a very strict line between themselves and their men, and then to enforce that line with violence. So, this is a pretty famous illustration. I, in addition to loving WPO and your organization, I love the Discover Lewis and Clark website, and they've got a version of it. But 1803, you can see what the soldiers' uniforms looked like. And just to run through, when Lewis was reviewing the different captains, he called Bissell, who Ordway ended up transferring and serving under, and was under when he ended up meeting with Lewis and Clark, a first-class officer and a Federalist. Lyman was listed as a second-class officer, but a Democratic Republican. Obviously, and Jefferson just chose to keep both of them on after he culled the officer corps. And then, of course, it's always worth remembering that the other soldiers, were honor-obsessed drunks. There's lots of good scholarship that shows that soldiers, the pay wasn't great, the circumstances weren't great, so a certain kind of man would often enlist a man with a taste for violence, a man with who enjoyed indulging in substances, maybe just to kind of numb the pain of and the boredom of the military experience. But this is the kind of world that Ordway is in. New documents and my approach and how it helped me find new documents. Once I knew that Ordway spent a certain amount of time under Lyman and then by a certain date had transferred to Bissell, I went through the records of the Secretary of War. These records would never mention a regular soldier. So it's not like we're going to find John Ordway's name under here, except maybe on a muster roll or something like that, and Donald Jackson did find some of that. But I'm just looking at sort of units. What did Ordway do? He was under Captain Bissell. That was his commander. That was his company. What did he do? This is the unit that actually sent him to Kaskaskia to ultimately build the fort there. So I think the fastest way to do this is just to run through a quick timeline of Ordway's life. And some of it's review. We talked about how he was born in New Hampshire, how he was placed. His brother moves north. Ordway moves north himself. He meets Betsy Crosby. In 1800, we know that he enlists with Cornelius Lyman, probably because of that ad that we spent a little time talking about. By September 1800, Ordway is transferred to be under Russell Bissell. It's important to know that Ordway is already a sergeant by this point. And I talked to some military historians who really study this period, and I was like, well, why did he become a sergeant? Did somebody just see something special in him right away? And they said, no, it's just because he could read. Like, if you can read and you're willing to be a soldier, you're gonna become a sergeant. That's just the kind of demographics that they were dealing with. So Ordway very quickly became a sergeant, but we also know he became an exemplary sergeant as well. So in January 1801, Ordway ends up going to Cantonment Wilkinsonville. This is a place that's mostly forgotten today, but at the time it was a huge gathering of American soldiers. It was a place where Hamilton and then later Jefferson were really concerned about the West and trying to gather America's military might and be ready for whatever international events would happen next. You'll note in Lewis, and Moulton has a wonderful note about this in his journal, but when Lewis and also Clark and York are going down the river, they passed Wilkinsonville on November 14th. This was the place where Ordway spent some time. Here's the thing, Wilkinsonville was terrible. It was a disaster. Ordway spent a few months there. Patrick Gass was there. Other soldiers were there. But there were horrible rat infestations. There was a malaria outbreak that killed close to 80 men. There was a tornado that came through and hurt at least 30 men, broke a bunch of limbs. It was a terrible, terrible time. And so eventually Ordway and the different companies get sent out. So I tried to track again, where did Russell Bissell's company end up? What did Ordway do after Wilkinsonville, but before Fort Kaskaskia? This is pretty interesting. He ended up clearing the Natchez Trace. So, such an important road for the story of Lewis and Clark. It was a native road at first that was slowly being broadened and improved, and Ordway led one of the gangs that was clearing that road and building it out so it would eventually become a road that travelers could use. March 1802, Ordway heads to Kaskaskia, and he does that because of the Peace Military Act that Jefferson passed that sort of changed where, fewer people can become officers. This act obviously had real implications for William Clark, but it had real implications for John Ordway too, which is that he gets shipped to a new fort very far to the west. It's a tense time because of drama between America, Spain, France, Britain. Everybody's sort of positioning, and there's a lot of tension there. But ultimately, it ends up being pretty boring for Ordway because no battles or wars actually happen. There's just a lot of, let's build a fort. Nope, let's build a different fort. So once again, I want to share a passage from the book where we just sort of talk about what Ordway was dealing with at this time. Honestly, what had Army life given him? The most action he'd seen in 3+ years was clearing a road. Other than that, he'd built huts, then abandoned huts, then built huts in a slightly different spot, all while waiting for a potential order to move out and build more huts. So the sergeant waited. For his next order, yes, but mostly for the end of his military career. Jefferson's officer Cole meant that a slow rise like Captain Bissell's, always a long shot, even for a sergeant as talented as Ordway, was now impossible. All Ordway could do was save his salary. He could write letters. He could brighten for an afternoon when he ran into some other soldiers from New England. Most of all, he could dream about Betsy and farmland and books, counting down the days he had left burying trash, corralling drunks, and staring at a muddy and mostly empty river. So, this is, of course, what's happening to John Ordway during this time period. This is what's on his mind. And then who shows up in that muddy and mostly empty river but a barge moving rather gracelessly towards St. Louis, and Ordway gets to join. So the last point I want to share about how this works, and then I'm happy to take any questions, is that using these perspectives allows us to read the journals differently. This is the last page of Ordway's journal, of course. I'll try to go through this pretty quickly so we can have more time for questions if people want it. I think it's important to remember that Camp River Dubois, and that's what I call it in my book because that's what John Ordway called it. This chapter is from his perspective, so I was like, let's let the enlisted guy name the camp. So I know there are different names for it, but I just call it Camp River Dubois. It's important to remember that this was easily the best place Ordway had ever served. They actually had enough medicine because of Lewis's careful planning. They actually had warm uniforms because of Lewis's careful planning. If you look at the documents and military history from this period, that was very rare. But there, they actually had what they needed. So in some ways, Ordway wasn't just thrilled to be going on this huge patriotic mission. He was thrilled that if somebody got sick, they actually had the medicine they needed. But there's one way that's really important, I think, to remember that this was not the best place he'd ever served, or at least it was the most strange place. And that's what I call in my book the experiment. Because once you understand that, just using the Articles of War to literally interpret what happened or didn't happen in the time doesn't really make sense. And scholars, again, repeatedly say that doesn't make sense. Officers had flexibility. Lewis and Clark used that flexibility in a radically different way than Lyman would have used it as a captain, or even Bissell would have used it as a captain. What they decided to do was to avoid physical punishment, empower the men, bring them into the decision-making process. And I spend a lot of time talking about this because, to me, this decision to run a military unit in a totally different way that is completely antithetical to how everybody approached military culture in this time, to me, that's just as bold as deciding we're going to have 2 captains in our unit. That's obviously the most famous choice that Lewis and Clark made, but this other choice is just as strange and striking, and I think that the 2 choices fit together, right? Like, if we're going to have a unit where 2 people can be captains, we're also going to have a unit where lots of people are going to have input, and where we're going to try to avoid, solving every problem through beating. Let's think about this from Ordway's perspective, though. In February, after there's been already a lot of troublemaking at Camp River Dubois, but again, not a lot of physical punishment. Remember, my favorite example, of course, is that when so many men get in trouble, Clark says, all right, the troublemakers are going to build the new hut for the woman who's washing our clothes. And what I always think is, boy, that must have been a fast hut to build. Because there were so many people already named who getting in trouble for brawling, for drinking, that, they had plenty of people helping out with that project. But it's important to note that, in most other forts, if the men did that, their officer would give them 100 lashes or 50 lashes. Clark and Lewis decided not to do that. But eventually, Clark and Lewis decided to leave. So on February 20th, Lewis writes his detachment order, At that evening's parade, Ordway gets up to read it, and he has to say, basically, Sergeant Ordway is in charge. And after that, as we all know, all hell broke loose. But I think it's worth taking time to really read those moments carefully and see things that we maybe have not seen. So the problems come with Coulter and Shields and Fields after when Lewis and Clark aren't there. But if you look at it, Clark had recorded at least 30 incidents. This is up to this point, before February 20th. So when Lewis or Clark are still there, they've already had more than 30 incidents of troublemaking that Clark deemed worth writing down. I'm sure were more than those. But of those 30 plus incidents, only one of them came from somebody in Kentucky. Remember, the camp is made up of two groups of people: professional soldiers, some of whom know each other, some of whom don't, and then the civilians that Clark has recruited from Kentucky who go on to become essential members. The Kentuckian people, while Clark is there, do not cause trouble at all. They don't. But the second Lewis and Clark are gone, who are the three people who cause trouble? Who are the three people who tell Ordway, I'm not going to do what you say. You want me to stand guard? I don't care. You can't make me. I'm not going to do that. It's the Kentuckians. So I think this really shows the split between the two sides and what a precarious situation Ordway is in. Again, think about this from his perspective. We know from Clark's notes that Coulter was loading the rifle next to him. So Ordway is standing there. He's got a sergeant's sword at his side. So, he's got Shields insulting him. He's got Coulter using his he can hear the scrape of Coulter's ramrod in his rifle, and they're both saying, we hate you. Coulter's saying, I'm going to kill you. John Ordway is in the right. He's the officer. He has flexibility. If he pulled out his sword and stabbed somebody, he would have been doing his job. But he would not have been doing what the captains wanted him to do. Ordway had a moment there, a chance to make a choice. And I think it was a very important moment. I think at those moments, if Ordway strikes, who's to say the camp doesn't turn on each other? Who's to say the professional soldiers aren't on Ordway's side, the Kentuckians are on Coulter's side, and all of a sudden we have a huge brawl or worse happening right then? And let's remember, this is a very politically partisan time. So if the headlines show up a couple months later in Washington, the president's secretary was off eating a fancy meal in St. Louis. And while he was doing that, his 30 soldiers on this fanciful mission to the middle of this fanciful potential territory ended up trying to kill each other. Great president, great plan. This is what we get from our philosopher in chief. The attack ads kind of write themselves, right? There's one person who decides whether this happens or doesn't. It's not Lewis. It's not Clark. It's John Ordway standing there, having men scream at him, having men threaten to kill him, and deciding, what am I going to do? We all know the choice he made, and I think it was a very consequential choice. One other thing I want to call attention to from the journals, and again, this is the kind of thing where Moulton's establishment of the text and then the digital edition makes it easy to notice. If you look on March 31st, when they finally split the party into different squads, they use the phrase duly balloted. And if you go back and read how that phrase is used back then, it means the men get to choose. They get to make a choice. They vote. So once again, we're seeing the experiment in action, right? After February, after the violence, after the captains try to calm everybody down and restore morale, they decide, well, let's split the men into squads and maybe that'll help. They let the men make a choice, which sometimes would happen in the militia, but in the regular army at this time period, very unusual. And what I think is so powerful is that John Coulter, the guy who was ready to kill John Ordway, said, I want that guy to be my sergeant. When he was duly balloted, he said, I want to be in Ordway's unit. And that to me speaks to Ordway's character. The fact that, it took a while for the Kentuckians to adjust to military culture. It took a while for them to trust Ordway. Maybe they didn't like Ordway. Maybe they didn't like any of the non-commissioned officers, but they respected them. And when John Coulter could have chosen, I'm going to serve under a Kentuckian, I'm going to go to a unit where I know, he said, no, I've seen enough from John Ordway that in what's ahead, and we don't know what's ahead, I'd rather have John Ordway in charge of me than anybody else. I just think that's a really powerful and wonderful moment. All right, quickly through another example of the journals, this time during the portage. So we all know about the portage. The first leg, Lewis and Clark take it. They have 22 guys with one of the canoes on a wagon. I did some calculations, talked to some experts. Let's say that one of those wagons weighs close to 2,000 pounds. A lot of work for 22 people. Ordway gets the day off. Ordway takes over on June 24th, and from here on out, Lewis is working on the iron frame boat, Clark is drawing a map, so Ordway is the one in charge of the portage for the vast majority of the portage. Except this time, it's only 20 men, roughly, and 2 canoes, so the work is already getting much harder. By June 22nd, Ordway wakes up that morning. He's at the Upper Portage camp. He goes to check on White House as one of his first things because his soldier's sick. And Ordway, you can tell in his journals, is always thinking about individual men, who's sick, who's hurting, who needs what. That's just how his brain works as a sergeant. But his other move is to go and see the falls. I just think it's worth noting, again, using this kind of approach of looking at perspectives, that he went to see the falls 2 weeks after Lewis, 10 days after Clark. But that's just the life of an enlisted man, right? Like that's, the officers get to do things you don't. They get to do things before you do. Ordway accepted that and understood that. By the end, we all know how terrible the portage is. And on June 29th, that's when, and my favorite detail is that it kept raining and hailing so much that Ordway just decided to sleep in the partially dug cache hole. Better safe than sorry, I guess. But by July 29th, that's when the huge hailstorm breaks forth. And Ordway says, "We were much bruised by the large hail, some nearly killed." So Ordway, writing this, says, we might have died. That's how bad the storm was. That's how afraid we were. Now, I want you to look at a couple lines from another journal entry. On June 30th, and it's easy to overlook this because so much is happening. We've got Sacagawea, the flood, the iron frame boat. But because I was writing about the portage from Ordway's perspective, I noticed what Clark wrote on June 30th. He's sort of just making his basic notes, and he writes, "Men complain of being sore this day, dull and lolling about." Ordway, for his journal entry on this day, and who can blame him given how tired they were, he just copied Clark's entry. But notice what he did not put in there. That sentence, "Men complain of being sore this day, dull and lolling about." Ordway had another choice, and he was reading Clark's journal, copying it down. I think, what would that sentence have felt like to him? The day before, he was worried he and his men were going to die in a hailstorm. Clark wasn't out in that. Clark was safe. And then Clark in his journal, Clark's frustrated, Clark's tired, everything's late, everything's a mess. Clark writes, "The men are complaining, they're being dull and lolling about." That had to make John Ordway angry. That had to frustrate him to think that his officer is saying that. But Ordway didn't pick a fight. He didn't lead a mutiny. He didn't complain. He just did something else, and I'm glad he did it because we can recapture this moment and understand it. He just didn't copy that sentence. As Ordway was writing down the journal, he said, "You know what? I'm going to write down all the important stuff. I'll make sure I get the latitude and longitude data, but I don't have to write everything, and I don't really feel like writing that my men were dull and lolling because my men were just bleeding." That's what was going on with my men. Again, paying close attention and looking carefully, I think we can notice things that might be harder to see otherwise. I'm going to skip a little bit more here because I want to save some time for questions, but just speaking again about the book, we've got 32 pages of color images, which I worked really hard on. This is, of course, Shannon's sewing kit, and this picture is often seen in black and white, but I got a color one from the Oregon Historical Society, and if you zoom in there, you can actually see the needle that Shannon used almost certainly to, make moccasins and other pieces of clothing. So, just as a reminder, if this book sounds like something you're interested in, you go to bookshop.org and pre-order. I put all this stuff in the comments of our discussion here, so you can see it, the link and the code and all that. You can get the discount, you can get the pre-order bonuses and all that stuff. But that's there, and my email's there too if anybody has any questions. But that's my Ordway presentation. I have a lot more to say about him, but I wanted you to just kind of see what this method was, how it works, and how it made it possible to find new things. And yeah, so thanks for listening. And if anybody has any questions or anything like that, I'd love to hear them.